Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, coming up on today's programme. Ukraine's Western allies appear to be focusing on diplomacy to prepare Ukraine for talks with President Putin. That's despite NATO warnings of his, quote, reckless actions. After seizing Aleppo, Syria's opposition forces are closing in on Hama in an unprecedented offensive against the Syrian government. Joining us in just a moment is Robert S. Ford, the former and last US ambassador to Damascus. And the US President Joe Biden's decision to grant his son a full pardon has triggered more reaction and more debate on the use of the pardon system. Hello and welcome to the programme. First, world leaders are weighing up whether the solution for Ukraine lies in more military aid or increased diplomacy with Russia. Well, speaking last night, the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer said in a closely watched foreign policy speech that his goal was to, quote, put Ukraine in the strongest possible position for negotiations. Well, just last month, both Starmer and the French President Emmanuel Macron pledged to support Ukraine unwaveringly and for as long as was necessary to counter Russia. But that seems to have changed for now.
We must continue to back Ukraine and do what it takes to support their self-defense for as long as it takes, to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position for negotiations so that they can secure a just and lasting peace on their terms that guarantees their security, independence, and the right to choose their future.
The British Prime Minister speaking there. Meanwhile, the Biden administration is rushing to send Ukraine another weapons aid package. That's despite concerns over depleting US stockpiles. And NATO's new Secretary General Mark Rutte says that President Putin is ramping up his, quote, reckless actions in Ukraine and is therefore pushing Ukraine's allies to step up military aid.
Ukraine is entering another crucial winter, and Russia's aggression shows no sign of abating. Just the opposite. Putin is ramping up his rhetoric and reckless actions. He is using Ukraine as a testing ground for experimental missiles and is deploying North Korean soldiers in this illegal war. Putin is not interested in peace. He is pressing on, trying to take more territory, because he thinks he can break Ukraine's resolve and ours. But he is wrong.
The NATO Secretary General speaking there. Well, NATO's foreign ministers are meeting in Brussels today to discuss the war in Ukraine and plans for future support. Well, for the latest, we can speak now to Michael Binyon, who is the Times of London's former foreign and Moscow correspondent and current editorial writer. Thank you so much for being with us. Let's start by talking about the discussions in Brussels and just listening as well to those clips before we cross to you. And there doesn't there, seem to be a realization amongst Ukraine's allies that a deal, some sort of a negotiated settlement, looks increasingly likely. Do you share that opinion?
Yes, I do. I think it's the war as it now is going on is unsustainable for Ukraine. Sadly, they have lost a very large number of people. They're also having high desertion rates, and opinion polls within Ukraine have shown that more than half the population now thinks they would like to negotiate some sort of deal with the Russians. The key thing, of course, is a deal that is at least gives Ukraine a measure of its own independence and future, and isn't just a pure surrender to everything that Russia wants. And that is very difficult to achieve without considerable pressure on Russia, which means that Ukraine, for now, needs to be supported as much as it can militarily and politically.
Yeah, and Ukraine once again calling for NATO membership and really appealing to those assembled in Brussels to give it to the country. He says it's the only real guarantee for its security going forward. I mean, do you think it's likely to get that membership anytime soon?
Well, actually, I don't know. I mean, I know that words were said at the last NATO meeting and encouraging phrases about, sometime in the future. But to be realistic, it seems very unlikely, partly because both Germany and the United States, key large NATO contributors, are opposed to the idea, and also because under NATO rules, you're not allowed to be a member of the alliance unless you control all your territory. And since Ukraine will not renounce any territory that the Russians continue to occupy, it won't have full control of its entire territory. Nevertheless, I think some sort of a security guarantee could be given to Ukraine without it actually being a full member of the alliance.
OK, we heard a clip of Mark Rutte just before we crossed to you. He said, amongst other things as well, quote, Putin is not interested in peace. He's pressing on, trying to take more territory because he thinks he can break Ukraine's territory and our resolve as well. I mean, do you buy into this argument of strengthening Kyiv ahead of negotiations? How would that work?
Well, it means giving Kyiv the weapons it needs, and very quickly. I mean, lots has been promised, but not enough delivered and not enough on time. So it does mean rushing things forward as fast as possible. But it's also true that Putin is trying to grab as much territory as possible, because the shape of a future deal, I mean, it's already clear to most people, and that is that the front line is frozen more or less where it is. There will be a ceasefire. I'm afraid there will be no peace deal because neither Ukraine nor Russia trust each other, and certainly no one trusts Putin. But if the conflict is frozen where it is, then Russia will be in a hurry to grab as much territory as possible. Obviously, the Ukrainians would have to withdraw from the Kursk area after their incursion there, but otherwise the lines will probably be frozen where they end up when the actual ceasefire comes into effect.
Yeah, I mean, we heard the United States is sending another $725 million worth of weaponry and military support to Ukraine, obviously angering Moscow even more, who says this is, again, pouring oil on the fire or fuel on the fire. I mean, how do you think Moscow envisions things unfolding?
Well, I think they see things actually moving more or less in their direction. I mean, their illusion that Trump would just give them anything on a plate, which they seem to have harbored for a while, I think will be shattered, because I don't think Trump will do that, certainly because his opponents in America are taunting him with the idea that if he just turns Ukraine over to the Russians, he would be scuttling out in the same way that Biden scuttled out of Afghanistan, which Trump criticized very strongly at the time. And I think there are resounding efforts from all parties, Europe, America's allies, the NATO Secretary General, and everyone else, to tell Mr. Trump that Ukraine is actually essential, arming Ukraine is essential for general Western defense in the face of aggression, because otherwise America will look weak and other allies will cease to rely on it and trust its word. So I think Mr. Trump will not be a pushover that the Russians had hoped. Nevertheless, they are in a strong position at the moment. They are moving forward fast. They have learned a lot of military lessons that they clearly didn't know at the beginning of the campaign when they fought so badly. Things are going their way, and Ukraine is increasingly desperate, short of ammunition, short of men, and now I have to say, short of morale.
Yeah, and just picking up on one of the points you made there, I mean, just echoing one of your early points, the NATO Secretary General said that a bad deal ran the risk of emboldening China and North Korea. So, you know, far-reaching implications of a bad deal if such a deal was struck in Ukraine. I mean, do you get the sense that the incoming Trump administration is now beginning to realize this is a lot more complicated than it looked on the campaign trail and not the sort of situation that can be resolved in a short telephone conversation?
Well, I think actually being in power brings a sense of realism to any administration, and whatever they say in advance, the facts on the ground and the briefings they'll get, especially from the United States military and from senior intelligence officers, will make them understand that there is quite a lot to be done. I mean, you do need the initial conviction and push from the president himself, and he's determined to try to get this resolved, as much for his own glory as for the sake of Western solidarity and defense. But I think it will mean that it's not quite as simple as just ending it in 24 hours, which is what he said he would do on the campaign trail.
And Donald Trump has said in the last couple of days he's got a new Ukraine envoy as part of his lineup by the name of Keith Kellogg. I was just wondering whether you know anything about him and what you think he perhaps brings to the table.
Well, General Kellogg has had quite a long experience with dealing with Ukraine already, and he is already on top of the issue. I mean, I think he's got all the briefings, and he's been there and seen things and understands. He's met people from Ukraine. So I think he has the facts at his fingertips, which of course is essential if you want to plot the next move and do so quickly. So he's probably quite a good choice. He is pretty skeptical and has been publicly of Ukraine's ability to continue fighting. It may sound disheartening to the Ukrainians, but I think there is a sense of realism there. And however much the West should and ought and will, I think, support Ukraine, the fact is they're in a very difficult position at the moment, and that should be recognized.
Do you get the impression that if the new administration in Washington were to reduce support or pull the plug entirely in its support for Ukraine, where the European powers would step up to the plate and fill the void? Can they step up to the plate and fill the void?
Well, that's the big question, and that's the one that the Europeans have been privately discussing among themselves for 2 or 3 months now. Well, at least since Mr. Trump was elected. And the possibility of him being elected made them focus on that even before then. And yes, they would have to step up to the plate, certainly if the United States cut off all military aid and did so quickly, then I think it would be extremely difficult for the Europeans to support Ukraine to the level that it made fighting a realistic possibility. The Europeans have given away most of the stuff that was on their shelves already. They have no spare ammunition, tanks, aircraft, and other necessary things to just turn over to Ukraine without actually ramping up their production very quickly. Also, it would cost an enormous amount of money. And for all the goodwill there is in Europe, I don't think European public opinion is ready to pay the huge taxes that would be needed to raise the money for such an increase in defence spending.
Just before we cross to you, we heard a clip of the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, sounding extremely resolute in his support and British support for Ukraine. I mean, the United Kingdom sounding like it's been one of the most supportive countries to Ukraine since the beginning of the conflict. Do you think that Sir Keir Starmer is going to be able to win over Donald Trump and somehow exert some influence on him to sort of bring him into the fold of Ukraine supporters? How do you rate his chances?
Well, that's the big question for Starmer. I mean, in many areas, Ukraine especially, but in other areas as well, it looks as though that Labour, well, the Prime Minister and the present government, is being asked to choose between the European Union, where he wants to get closer, and the United States. And this is in a whole series of things like climate change, raising tariffs, all the other things that Mr. Trump has promised to do that may be cause of conflict with Europe. And how that Britain can actually keep a foot in both camps is going to be difficult. But clearly, I think Starmer wants to strengthen the alliance with America as much as possible and show solidarity in the hope of being able to influence Trump along the lines of what many Europeans would like to see, particularly over Ukraine.
And just lastly, I mean, going back to the situation on the battleground and really re-examining any eventual negotiations that we were talking about at the beginning. I mean, do you think it's fair to say that with each passing day, as we see, and as you've been saying, Ukraine's forces are struggling, notably on the Eastern Front. So we've got news today of more villages being captured by Russia in the southeast. Do you think it's fair to say that Ukraine's negotiating position is in fact getting weaker by the day as things currently stand?
It is indeed, and of course Putin knows that, and that's why Putin is in no hurry to make any deal, because he thinks that the Ukrainian resistance may collapse altogether if he holds on for long enough and sends wave after wave of more Russian soldiers. The problem for Ukraine is shortage of manpower. They have a much smaller population anyway. They've suffered a large number of casualties. We don't know the exact number, but very many. And there is increasing reluctance among young Ukrainians to serve in the army. There's been a high rate of desertion now. A lot of people are dodging the draft. And without full commitment by everyone, it's getting difficult. And of course, the other problem is people are increasingly reluctant to serve on the front if they think they've not got the right air cover to protect them. And at the moment, they don't have that. They don't have the weapons they need to stop these much more efficient Russian drone and missile attacks and the sheer weight of numbers that Russia is throwing against them.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but thank you very much indeed. We really appreciate you speaking to us. Michael Binyon, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Meanwhile, the Ukrainian foreign minister is calling on NATO allies to send at least 20 more air defense systems to stave off Russian attacks. This following on from the recent strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Well, let's get some more analysis now from Sir Gerald Howarth, who is the former British Defence Minister. Sir Gerald, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. The British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, gave an important speech on foreign affairs at the Lord Mayor's annual banquet in London. We heard a clip of it before we crossed to you. The UK, he says, is going to continue backing Ukraine for as long as it takes. I mean, do you get the impression that the UK has done enough?
No, I don't think the UK has done enough, but then the UK has done far more than virtually every other country, except belatedly, of course, in the case of the United States, where President Biden, pressed by Prime Minister Boris Johnson, did eventually take action. But all his actions have been wrung out of him after pressure, a bit here and a bit there. And it's all, I'm afraid, in my view, too late. But the United Kingdom has played an important role. And in fairness to the current government, I think that Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has been uncompromising in his assertion that the United Kingdom stands foursquare with Ukraine, but under no circumstances should we or anybody else tell Ukraine to give up their sovereign territory to Russia as a result of its brutal invasion. That would be reprehensible in my view, not least because we are signatories to the Budapest Memorandum, signed 29 years ago this week by the President of Russia, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, President of the United States, under which we agreed to respect the sovereignty, independence, and existing borders of Ukraine in return for Ukraine giving up its entire arsenal of nuclear weapons. So Russia is in flagrant breach of an agreement itself signed.
Yeah, I want to come back to you on the Budapest Memorandum in just a moment, but I want to pick up on something else you were saying at the beginning there about how a lot of the weaponry that has been given to Ukraine, a lot of the assistance that's been given to Ukraine has come rather late in the day. And I'd just like to ask for your thoughts on that. Why don't you think it was given earlier?
Oh, it's perfectly clear. It was not given earlier because of the fear of escalation. We were too timid, in my view. I thought right at the outset that we should do absolutely everything possible, throw as much weaponry in support of Ukraine as we possibly could. It frustrated me that the Germans weren't prepared to send tanks, the Americans weren't prepared to allow F-15s to go to Ukraine. And it was all just too little, too late. And Putin could see that and has taken advantage of it. When all those tanks were lined up outside Kyiv, when they were stuck in the mud, I must say at the time I thought, well, the answer is just zap the whole lot of them and send them back to Russia. But this fear of escalation has dogged us all the way through. And Putin's played upon it.
Indeed, that's something we've heard a lot from our Ukraine guests, the psychological dynamic to this warfare. Do you think with the benefit of hindsight, you'd say that there should have been boots on the ground? Ukraine's allies should have sent in soldiers?
Well, I did suggest that right at the outset. So in my case, I would argue it was not with the benefit of hindsight, is what I thought at the time we needed to do. But it was clearly going to be a very, very tricky, potentially very dangerous move to have made by the United Kingdom and our allies. So we certainly couldn't have done it on our own. But belatedly, everybody now is saying that Russia must not be allowed to succeed. Now, if they'd said that right at the outset, taken action immediately, imposed all the sanctions immediately, cut off the oil supply, and delivered the weapons, it might have been a different story. But dribbling out support as we have done over the past 2.5 years has not been in our best interest. But even now, if we can supply the equipment that President Zelensky has asked for, we should do so. Meanwhile, we need to ramp up our own military production in the United Kingdom, across NATO, and in the United States too.
So just to pick up on what you've been saying, Sir Gerald, you'd sort of put this reluctance in the early days down to one thing, notably fear.
Yes, it was fear that it would cause escalation and that Russia would do goodness knows what. And all we have seen is escalation, but escalation by Russia. And now we have Putin saying that Biden is prolonging the war. Hold on, Mr. Putin. You didn't say this was a war. You said this was a special military operation. You are a liar. You are also arraigned before the International Criminal Court. There is a warrant out for your arrest. You have been abducting children, apparently in your own presidential aeroplanes, from Ukraine to Russia to Russify them. You are a rogue state, and you need to be dealt with as rogue states need to be dealt with. And very significantly, we've just heard this morning from the new Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who said that Russia and China have tried to destabilize nations with acts of sabotage, cyber attacks, disinformation, and blackmail to intimidate us. I mean, it doesn't get much worse than that. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, these are disturbing the entire world order. And we need to understand that unless we nip this in the bud, we are going to be back to where we were in the 1930s. And this is a very, very serious risk. And constantly being concerned, oh, we mustn't escalate. It is our failure. It is our fear of escalation by us that has resulted in the escalation by Russia of their unacceptable, disgusting brutality. And we simply have to stop it. If we do not stop it, imagine what the consequences will be. Who will be next? Because make no mistake about it, if Russia is allowed to keep some of the land that they have bombarded and stolen, whose people they have destroyed, whose buildings they have destroyed, do not imagine they are going to stop there. And you've heard today that the Kremlin has said that if NATO agrees to allow Ukraine to cede land to Russia and maintain and join NATO for what remains of Ukraine, the Kremlin would not accept that. These are nasty, nasty, brutal people, and they are liars. Their word cannot be trusted.
And yet, Sir Gerald, the British Prime Minister seems to be conceding to the fact that there should be and there will be a negotiated end to this conflict. Should Ukraine's allies, in your opinion, sit down at the negotiating table and negotiate with Vladimir Putin, given what you've just said about him?
Absolutely no way whatsoever. As I said right at the outset, the only people who are authorized, who have the right to cede part of their sovereign territory to another state are the people of Ukraine. If that is to happen, it must be a decision for them, and it is not our business either to advise them so to do, let alone to negotiate on their behalf with a brutal, repressive regime like that which operates in Moscow.
I just wanted to pick up on something you said about the Budapest Memorandum, because some of our viewers might not remember the significance of it. As you say, it's a nearly 30-year-old agreement, and it was intended, correct me if I'm wrong, to protect Ukraine in precisely the type of situation in which Ukraine finds itself today. Do you think, therefore, that this agreement is dead in the water?
Oh, clearly it's been dead in the water since the 22nd of February 2022, when Putin launched his his brutal invasion of Ukraine. His forebear, his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, was a signatory to that agreement. Therefore, Russia was bound by that agreement, as were the United Kingdom, the United States, and Ukraine. And it's a very simple question. Would Russia have invaded Ukraine had it still had the nuclear weapons which it gave up in response to the Budapest Memorandum? Of course not. Any more than Russia is going to attack the United States or attack the United Kingdom, because we have nuclear weapons. We have the targeting arrangements on Russia, and therefore we would retaliate immediately if they were to launch any kind of nuclear strike on any of us. So that's why Putin is not going to do it. So the Budapest Memorandum, of course, is rather important for your views. You're absolutely right. Your viewers do need to understand that it wasn't a guarantee of the security of Ukraine by Russia, Britain, and the United States. It was an agreement to respect the sovereignty, independence, and existing borders. And how you interpret that word respect, of course, is challenging. The agreement does, it's only a page and a half long, does provide for any disputes to be referred to the United Nations, but we've seen that that's been completely worthless. So it brings us back to, well, what did we mean by respect in this regard? And I have discussed it with former Prime Minister John Major when I was chairman of the All-Party Ukraine group in the United Kingdom Parliament. And I don't think that he had any clear idea, any more than I do, as to exactly what respect means. But in my personal view, it was very clear that in exchange for giving up all those nuclear weapons, and they were about the third largest arsenal in the world of such horrendous weapons, we, the signatories, Russia, United States, United Kingdom, agreed that Ukraine was a sovereign country, that its borders should be respected, and that's all been breached. And therefore, the United Nations being useless at doing anything about it, we are trying to do something about it. And I think that if, I repeat, we should be under no illusions whatever. If Putin is allowed to keep the land that he has stolen, he will regard that as a victory, albeit not the victory intended, because he intended to take the whole of Ukraine. He will still regard it and proclaim it as a victory. And then he will be emboldened to take action elsewhere. And we will be faced with a similar problem. And we will say to ourselves, oh, we mustn't escalate. And the man who will escalate will be Russia, will be Putin.
So
Serious times. And I hope your viewers out there in the Gulf do understand just how serious it is for them as well. Because if Russia, as a rogue state, is emboldened, so will Iran be emboldened, although Iran has been seriously damaged by Israel and by the failure of its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, to destroy Israel. Nevertheless, do understand that they will be emboldened if Russia succeeds.
Given what you were just saying about the Budapest Memorandum, given what you've said about the weaponry coming so late in the day and the hesitancy that we've seen from Ukraine's allies, you paint the picture that really Ukraine has been let down quite badly by its Western allies. Is that a correct assessment of what your take is on the situation? Yes,
I suppose the simple answer has to be yes, albeit that I do think that the whole of the West eventually came around to understanding the importance of supporting Ukraine, and to a greater or lesser extent, sovereign nations, particularly NATO members, have come to their aid. We've also, of course, provided refuge for many displaced Ukrainians who have fled the country. So I don't want to be overcritical, but this is politics, and I do want politicians to understand that if you appease an aggressor, you pay a big price. We have effectively appeased Moscow. And we are paying a price, and the Ukrainians are paying a very high price indeed. And I just feel that we should have acted more boldly and more quickly. I do salute Boris Johnson, who, in my view, took the lead on this, and without whose leadership we certainly wouldn't have had the Americans coming in and support. And I do find it astonishing that Republicans, I'm a conservative, I'm a Republican in American terms. I find it very depressing that our Republican friends have been so negative towards Ukraine, and so completely failing to understand the international ramifications of their failure to support what President Biden ultimately began to do in the way of practical hardware support to Ukraine. I've expressed this view to some of my friends in Washington, one of whom said that, Gerald, you need to understand they're just ignorant. And I do think that there is an element of isolationism in America. They go through periods of isolation from time to time. And there will be Americans who do not see Ukraine as being part of their business, as indeed there are people in the United Kingdom who take that view. But we come back to the Budapest Memorandum. Both the United States and the United Kingdom are signatories. And I believe that having signed that agreement, we have a duty to do whatever we can to support Ukraine. And frankly, the sooner Ukraine is in a position to join NATO, the better the security of Europe will be, because NATO threatens nobody. NATO is a defensive organization. Russia is not defensive. Russia is an offensive organization, which is why two hugely long-standing nations, which have been long-standing neutral nations, Finland and Sweden, just last year applied to join NATO because they too felt threatened by their neighbor, Russia.
Yeah, of course, talks are happening in Brussels today. The NATO allies are assembled there talking about the situation in Ukraine, and perhaps not resolute in their opinion and not speaking with one voice in terms of having Ukraine join the fold just yet. But just lastly, this is my last question to you. I just want to ask you, going back to where we started, talking about Keir Starmer and what he was saying last night, and picking up on what you were saying about Donald Trump's incoming administration and Republican hesitancy towards Ukraine. How do you rate Keir Starmer's chances of lobbying, whispering to Donald Trump and trying to bring him around to his way of thinking, many European nations' way of thinking on the subject of Ukraine? Do you think he'll succeed?
I genuinely don't know. One of the interesting things about Donald Trump is that one never knows quite what he's going to do next. And one imagines that actually he doesn't know what he's going to do next. But I do remember in 2016 being very concerned about his rhetoric about NATO and possible US withdrawal from NATO. And I bumped into the Prime Minister in the lobby of the House of Commons whilst we were voting on something. And she was just about to go to America to meet the new President Trump, the first overseas leader to see him. And I said to Theresa May, Prime Minister, when you go to Washington, please make it absolutely clear to President Trump that NATO is not just in the interests of the security of Europe, but it's also in the interests of the security of the United States. And Prime Minister May smiled at me and said, Gerald, I've already done it. And we saw that, in fact, he rode back from some of his rhetoric on NATO, that the United States remained a key member of NATO. But there was one change of significance resulting from Donald Trump's election as president, and that was that a number of European countries, members of NATO, stepped up their spending on defense, something that not just President Trump, but Prime Minister Cameron, when he was Prime Minister here, also called on those nations which were not spending 2% of GDP on defense should do. And that was a very positive result of the first Donald Trump presidency. And I like to think that he is a pragmatist, and when he takes office and receives the latest intelligence briefing from US intelligence people, that he will recognize that Russia is not an ally, is not a threat, is a threat, cannot be trusted, and therefore the United States must be bold. Whether it will happen or not, that remains to be seen.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. We really appreciate it. The former British Defence Minister, Sir Gerald Howarth. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Now, turning our attention to the situation in Syria. And after snatching Aleppo from the Syrian government, Syria's opposition forces are now approaching Hama in central Syria, seizing at least 20 towns and villages around the city during the course of the last few hours. Well, Hama is a strategic city that links Aleppo to the capital Damascus, and the province's western countryside is home to many Bashar al-Assad loyalists. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Robert S. Ford, the former and last US ambassador to Syria. Ambassador Ford, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. The situation in Syria, I think it's fair to say, hasn't changed very much over the course of the last decade. That is until now, this sudden resurgence of violence. It seems to have taken a lot of people by surprise. Did you see it coming?
No, I did not see it coming, and I know very few analysts or policymakers who anticipated this offensive.
What do you think is the thinking and the calculation with regards to timing that's been taken by these anti-government forces? What's your take?
I think the Syrian armed opposition forces sensed that the Lebanese Hezbollah positions and those of allied Iranian militias who had been fighting the Syrian armed opposition, they sensed that those Hezbollah and Iranian-backed militias were weaker after the fighting in Lebanon and after a fairly steady series of Israeli Air Force attacks on their positions up in north central Syria.
Okay, and we've had reaction from right across the world to the situation. But I just wanted to pick up on something said by Andrew Tabler, who's a senior advisor on Syria during the last Trump administration. He's now at the Washington Institute. He said the Biden administration didn't just put Syria on the back burner, they took it off the stove. You can take things off the stove all you want, but that doesn't mean they're not going to boil over. Do you agree with that assessment?
The Biden administration has not paid much attention to Syria. That is very true, although the Biden administration did leave about 1,000 American soldiers in eastern Syria, ostensibly on a mission to fight against the remnants of the Islamic State that are still present in eastern Syria. But I also have to say I differ a little bit with my friend Andrew in that I don't believe the United States can fix the Syrian crisis. I don't believe the United States by itself has the key to resolving the Syrian civil war.
Okay, they might not be able to fix it, but do you think Washington has got a preferred outcome here? And if so, what do you think it is?
I think in an ideal world, what Washington would like to see is a new government in Damascus that's moderate, that's probably a coalition of different elements of Syrian society, different Syrian communities, Kurds, Muslims, different sects and different ethnic groups. Syria is a mosaic, but Washington has no strategy for how to achieve that.
Indeed, and when you look at previous situations where there's been a change of administration in a country at the will of the West, it hasn't always worked out too well, thinking of Iraq in particular. I mean, do you think there is, for that very reason, a good deal of hesitancy about what to do next?
I think both the Trump administration before Biden and now Biden, and even going back to my time, with Barack Obama's administration, the bad experiences from Iraq, from Libya, and from Afghanistan have made Washington much more reticent to involve itself in civil wars in that part of the world. And I actually think that's a good thing.
There are some analysts talking now about an eventual negotiated solution in Syria. And I just wonder what your take is on that and what you think there is to negotiate.
I don't think there'll be a negotiated solution to the Syrian civil war anytime soon. I have seen no evidence over the last 13 years of President al-Assad's government being willing to make any political compromises, any political concessions, zero. And on the other side, the Syrian armed opposition, and in particular this group spearheading the offensive south towards Damascus, it's called HTS, I sense very little flexibility from them either. So we're more likely to see some kind of a ceasefire develop over the next couple of weeks to replace the ceasefire that was established in 2020. So perhaps by the end of the year, a new ceasefire with new ceasefire lines farther south than the 2020 ceasefire line.
But I mean, the situation is evolving extremely fast, has been for the last few days, and I'm sure you're following it very closely. So what is your understanding of just what the situation is right now on the ground in Syria?
I think the Syrian armed opposition, which in the entire history of the Syrian civil war has never been united, and it's not united now in late 2024. So one part of the Syrian armed opposition, backed by Turkey, is actually moving most of its forces east to capture territory from Syrian Kurdish militias, and in particular one Syrian Kurdish militia, which in the past has helped the United States against the Islamic State. The other part of the Syrian armed opposition, led by the group I mentioned, HTS, is not driving east, it's driving south in the general direction of the capital, and has now established outposts, front lines, near the Syrian city of Hama, which is about 130 kilometers south of Syria's second largest city, Aleppo, the city that fell over the weekend.
Okay, so just for the benefit of our viewers, and we've got a map I think we can bring up to show them. You've got Aleppo up there in the north. Hama is underneath that. Below that is Homs, and below that is the capital, Damascus. And just looking at that rapid progression from Aleppo to Hama, one of the other largest cities in the country, how vulnerable do you think this is all making the Syrian government look at this particular stage?
Well, definitely they look weak and they look vulnerable, but I would remind viewers of two things. Number one, the Syrian opposition, the armed opposition, is not united, as I said before, and the part of the armed opposition that is driving towards Hama and then Homs and then Damascus is not that big. It probably doesn't have more than 30 or 40,000 fighters. So I think well before they get near Damascus, if they even get past Hama, but if they were to really threaten Bashar al-Assad's hold on Damascus and probably even Homs, I think the Russians would scrape together some special operations forces, and the Iranians will assemble a force of militias from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, and flow them in to the battlefront to hold the battle line so that Assad's control over Damascus, in particular, and probably Homs, remains secure.
Yeah, you mentioned those Iraqi fighters that are helping the Syrian government. I mean, just give us a sense of who's on the battlefield that we should be looking out for. Anything striking about who's there, and perhaps more interestingly, who's not there at this stage?
Well, what strikes me as particularly interesting right now is that the Russian Air Force, which really helped turn the tide the last time Bashar al-Assad's defensive lines were crumbling. Now, that was back in 2015, 9 years ago. The Russians surged in about 36 aircraft and operated a very heavy operational set of airstrikes sometimes 30 or 40 a day, to stop the armed opposition advance back then in 2015. The Russian Air Force is not undertaking the same level of air operations now, and I think they have some fewer aircraft, and they certainly don't have as many men on the ground either. The Iranian-backed Hezbollah from Lebanon was fighting in 2015 and also has really been a key ally on the ground for Syria's Bashar al-Assad, but they were bloodied badly in Lebanon. And so they're really not in strength like they were, say, 5, 6, 9 years ago. And so that's why you've seen Assad's forces have to fall back, plus the element of surprise, and I think they were caught by surprise.
Just looking at the new administration in Washington coming to power in less than 2 months from now, one of Donald Trump's nominees is the intelligence chief designate Tulsi Gabbard. And in the past, just reading between the lines, she sounded somewhat sympathetic to President Bashar al-Assad. I don't know if you agree with that, and what you think that perhaps indicates to us about what the next administration might have planned or might have by way of desired outcome in Syria.
Well, first, it's too early to know. And second, the final decisions on especially American military involvement will go to Donald Trump. But I think useful for viewers to understand is that the Donald Trump administration will actually be composed of two different camps. There's a camp that really does not want to get involved in Syria, wants to get American military forces out of large parts of the Middle East. I wouldn't call them isolationists, but they certainly want the United States to exercise great restraint. And Tulsi Gabbard, whom you just mentioned, would fall in that camp. She will be working in the intelligence community if confirmed by the American Senate. Then you have a different camp, which is a more conservative foreign policy group that wants to resist Iranian influence in the Middle East, wants to reduce Iranian influence in the Middle East, and thinks that the United States needs to do more against Iran in places like Syria and Iraq. How Donald Trump comes out between these two camps is the key question. The only thing I know for certain is that Donald Trump wanted to withdraw completely from Syria in 2019, and Pentagon generals and State Department diplomats talked him out of it. But at the time, he called Syria nothing but a land of sand and death. I don't know if he's changed his mind.
Okay, and obviously, and this is the last question to you. I mean, do you think that one way or another we're looking at perhaps the beginnings of the end of what has been a 13-year-long conflict in Syria, or do you think we're perhaps looking at the beginning of a whole new chapter? What's your hunch?
My sense is that we will get another ceasefire probably in the next several weeks. And so it's difficult to say that Bashar al-Assad's government is going to fall or that he is going to leave power. That I do not see in the cards. And I think the Russians and the Iranians will do what it takes to keep him there. But the Syrian government and the Syrian state institutions, including the military, are steadily eroding and becoming weaker. There's a dynamic there, which I don't think the Russians and the Iranians can control. But what comes after Assad, that's also very opaque. And remember, there is no united Syrian opposition leadership, and that does not portend for a simple transfer of power.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for your time today. Ambassador Robert S. Ford, thank you for speaking to Al Arabiya News.
Thank you.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Mick Mulroy, who is the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East and the Pentagon's former top policy official for the Middle East, who joins us now from Montana in the US. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, sir. Just before we crossed you, we spoke to the last US ambassador to Damascus, Ambassador Ford, and we asked him whether this sudden resurgence of violence had taken him by surprise, whether he'd seen it coming. He said he hadn't seen it coming. Had you?
It's good to be with you, Tom, and your audience. I think that's fair with most people that even follow this very closely. They didn't expect this level of collapse of the regime at the hands of the rebels. Looking back, hindsight gives you perfect vision, but there was some indicators that it could, and that is, of course, that the Assad regime is propped up by the Russians, the Iranians, and then in large part from troops on the ground, Hezbollah, all of which are involved in their own conflict. And Hezbollah has actually pulled a lot of their forces back from places like Aleppo and throughout the Idlib province because of the Israeli invasion into southern Lebanon. So in hindsight, it does look like this could have happened, but I do think it caught most people, even analysts that follow this area, by surprise.
Okay, so I'm sure, like lots of other people in the United States, you are keeping a close eye on the situation in Syria. What do you think Washington's desired outcome is in this situation?
So it is very difficult. So in the past, we've had a policy of regime change that was obviously changed. It is important to point out the Assad regime is responsible for hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths in this civil war. But there's also an issue of stability and who would take over in the event, which I still think is unlikely, that there is a complete collapse of the regime. This is, of course, multiple different groups, HTS leading the way. That essentially came from an al-Qaeda-linked group, al-Nusra, the leadership. They've pulled a bit away from that ideology, but certainly is somewhat extreme. And a lot of these groups are supported by Turkey. I don't know that Turkey would have really wanted this to happen in the way it did, because it could also cause major influxes of refugees into Turkey. So I think the countries are all going to get together and try to determine what is the best outcome from the region, hopefully. And hopefully Assad, if that is, that he remains at the current time, is willing to negotiate with all the groups going forward. If not, then he's really going to have to rely on Russia fully committing to regime preservation in Syria.
Okay, so do you think it's looking more likely that we're heading down the route of further military action and a raising of the temperature in terms of the situation on the battlefield? Or do you think it's more likely we'll go down that other road that you just alluded to there, some sort of a negotiated settlement?
Well, I think, one of the issues is if this rebel group continues to push and doesn't have a lot of resistance, then of course they'll have less, I think, desire to enter some kind of negotiations. I mean, it's just how things work, particularly in that country at this time. So if Assad can't put up at least somewhat of a resistance to stalemate this successfully, then that makes the negotiations less likely. So we'll have to see in the coming days just what happens, whether Russia will fully come in, whether Hezbollah will redeploy forces to assist them, and of course, whether Iran will get more involved. A positive, of course, when it comes to the anti-Iran crowd is if Assad is removed, then that Shia corridor, as they called it, that can ship weapons into Hezbollah, is compromised. But again, it's unclear of what would happen if the Assad regime is thrown out.
And what do you think we might see by way of a shift in approach towards Damascus with the incoming administration in Washington? Of course, I'm talking about Donald Trump's return to the White House.
Well, that is a good question, because they have been, I would say, if on comparison to the Biden administration, the past Trump administration was very strong against Iran. And that's likely going to continue, as Iran has caused so much of the issues going on in the Middle East. They are getting closer to a nuclear weapon. And of course, there's media reports that they've even had plots to kill the incoming president. So if you look at it that way, in Assad being somewhat of a client state of Iran, then this could be bad or good for the anti-Assad forces. I do think that, of course, ultimately, foreign policy has to deal with pragmatism as well. They have to determine just what would replace them if something in this coalition would be the case, and then would that be better for our interests and their interests in the region? So there's a lot of unknown questions right now, but I do think the incoming Trump administration would be even more hard on Iran than the current Biden administration is.
The ambassador we were just speaking to, Robert Ford, the last US ambassador to Damascus, do you think it's right that the United States decided to pull out its diplomatic presence from Damascus? Or do you think they should have perhaps thought more recently about perhaps reinstating a diplomatic presence in the form of an ambassador, as some countries have started doing? And the most notable example I can think of is Italy, which has decided in the last couple of years to reinstate an ambassador to Damascus. What do you think the United States should have done?
So this is a tough call. I mean, we talked already a bit about just how brutal this regime of Bashar al-Assad is. And we did, of course, had a regime change policy. Of course, the United States does have ways to have diplomatic relations with them through partner countries and even through the intelligence services at times. I do think it's something that has to be constantly assessed to determine whether it is still in our interest not to have direct contact. That's shifting the diplomacy from, again, third parties, third countries, or the intelligence service to an official relationship. But that would probably have to be also somewhat of an acknowledgement that this regime is going to say. So that decision now from the incoming administration will have to be looked at from those regards.
Okay, and just lastly, I put the same question to Ambassador Ford. I'd just like to ask for your thoughts, your predictions. I know it's very difficult to predict where things are heading, especially in a situation that's moving as fast as this one and that took everyone, as we've been saying, by surprise. But what do you think is the likely next stage, and what sort of an end game might we be looking at here?
I would look very closely at Turkey. Most of the support that goes to these rebel groups comes through Turkey, and they can cut it off. And and I do believe that they think this is destabilizing, as it could shove millions more people into Turkey, then they can have a lot of leverage on HTS and the other groups. They can simply say, we'll cut you off. So if that is the case, I do think this will end with some kind of negotiated, say, diplomatic way ahead. It'll still be tense, but this is something that happens when you have groups that are solely reliable on third countries like Turkey and this rebel group. So I do think this will stop before there's a full regime change in Damascus.
All right. Well, thank you very much, indeed. We're going to have to leave it there. Mick Mulroy, thank you for speaking to us on Al Arabiya News. Now, in other news, already reeling from their November election defeat, the US Democratic Party is now grappling with President Joe Biden's decision to pardon his son, Hunter, for federal crimes. Well, some have called the move misguided and unwise. Others have gone further, saying it sets a dangerous precedent. Well, the incoming president, Donald Trump, has said that he is considering pardoning the rioters who attacked the Capitol on the 6th of January 3 years ago. Well, for more analysis, we're joined now by Richard Painter, former chief White House ethics lawyer in the administration of George W. Bush, who joins us now from St. Paul, Minnesota. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. In your opinion, was this the wrong decision by President Biden?
I do not fault President Biden for wanting to pardon his own son. The president has the power under the U.S. Constitution to pardon anybody, and this is fully understandable. What I strongly disagree with is President Biden's statement that he issued yesterday saying that the prosecution was unfair and was politically motivated. This was a prosecution undertaken by an independent prosecutor appointed by the United States Department of Justice, which has been supervised for 4 years by Attorney General Merrick Garland, who was appointed by President Biden himself. And we've had multiple prosecutions of high-profile figures, not just Hunter Biden, but of course President-elect Trump, in 2 cases brought by the Department of Justice. And President-elect Trump is saying that those prosecutions were politically motivated, which I also do not think is true. It does not help for President Biden to be undermining his own Justice Department and the independent prosecutors who've been appointed pursuant to the Department of Justice regulations. Hunter Biden was duly convicted of crimes. These are not heinous crimes, crimes that probably wouldn't result in jail time. I fully understand the pardon of his own son, but the attacks on the Department of Justice are not justified and will encourage more attacks next year by the incoming administration, attacks against career prosecutors. political attacks, and I just don't think that's appropriate.
Yeah, of course, President Biden pledged that he wasn't going to do this, and then he changed his mind. And I'm just wondering what you think has got people so angry, because let's be clear, this story isn't going away. People are furious about this in the United States. Do you think people are angriest about the fact that President Biden went back on a promise, or do you think they're angriest about the fact that he's decided to pardon his own son?
Well, presidents make campaign promises and then break those promises over and over again. I don't think this was a credible campaign promise. I never believed it. I wish the Biden White House had not kept repeating it. They simply should have said no comment on the Hunter Biden case, and that would have been good enough. So I wish they hadn't been talking about it so much. But yes, presidents do break campaign promises, and clearly President Biden did this here. But he's trying to explain his way out of that by attacking the prosecution, attacking the Justice Department, and the integrity of the independent counsel was a serious mistake. The claims the president is making about the independent counsel are not accurate, and this just feeds the flames of animosity toward the Justice Department from the political right. And those claims, of course, those allegations will accelerate when Donald Trump takes office. We need an independent Department of Justice where the president is not pressuring the Department of Justice, where the president is not attacking prosecutors, tweeting at prosecutors, that type of thing. We saw it in the first Trump term, and I'm very disappointed that President Biden has used a little bit of the same playbook involving the case, the Hunter Biden case. I wish he'd just simply issued the pardon, no comment, move on.
Yeah, the New York Times has got an argument as to why he changed his mind, and I wonder whether you could help me understand it. They say that the ongoing pressure of these legal trials could have some impact on Hunter Biden's mental well-being, his sobriety. I mean, do you think there's much sympathy in the American public for the situation the president found himself in and this risk, according to the New York Times, that his son's health could deteriorate as a result?
Well, I believe there's some sympathy. His son, Hunter, has had serious issues with substance abuse and other issues over many decades. And once again, I think that everyone would understand why a father who has the power to pardon a son in this situation would do it. But as the Biden administration digs in explaining why the president did it, the explanations that attack the integrity of the prosecution team, the integrity of the Department of Justice, are very, very dangerous, particularly with the incoming administration being supported by quite a few people who have been openly hostile to the Department of Justice and the FBI. So I wish that President Biden would adhere to his oath of office to uphold the law by supporting his Justice Department, grant the pardon to his son. He did that. I'm not complaining about that. But he should not be attacking our justice system, which is fair, was fair to Hunter Biden, and was fair to Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying that this is, in some respect, a gift to the incoming Trump administration. And in fact, a spokesperson for Donald Trump, Stephen Chung, says that this shows that the system of justice must be fixed and due process must be restored for all Americans, which is exactly what President Trump will do as soon as he returns to the White House with an overwhelming mandate from the American people. I mean, it sounds like this is indeed, as you're saying, a gift to the incoming administration.
Well, this certainly feeds the flames. We've always had people who attack the integrity of the justice system, and there are problems with prosecutorial systems like every other system, but our system of independent prosecutors being appointed by the Department of Justice has worked. Our independent counsel law worked for 20 years. We had independent counsels who reported to the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, but it was the Democrats who attacked that system when Ken Starr prosecuted Bill Clinton for perjury, and that we don't have an independent counsel law anymore. We have the system of appointed independent special prosecutors through the Justice Department. but I don't think these are partisan attacks on prosecutors simply for doing their jobs help. Whether it was attacks on Ken Starr in the 1990s, the attacks the attacks that President Biden has launched against the prosecution team in Delaware in the Hunter Biden case, or the repeated attacks on the Department of Justice and the FBI by numerous people associated with the incoming Trump administration, including at times the president-elect himself. This is very, very dangerous, this rhetoric that somehow prosecutions are politicized. So the answer is for the president of the United States to take over the Justice Department and politicize everything that much more and start pursuing his political enemies. And that's the type of rhetoric we're dealing with right now. And I think what President Biden said yesterday will only encourage that.
Yeah, so this idea of public trust in the Department of Justice being sort of undermined by decisions like this is something we've been hearing quite a lot. And, you know, this idea, perhaps in some people's mind, that here is the President of the United States putting his family before the country. I mean, how does all of this look, do you think, to the average American?
Well, this situation does not look good at all. Let's remember that President Biden, the Justice Department did not appoint an independent prosecutor in the Donald Trump cases until almost 2 years into President Biden's term. And that's the reason those cases were so late being filed, and they simply ran out of time. President-elect Trump ran out the clock on those cases. President Biden was hostile to independent prosecutors from day one. Part of that may have been the problems that Hunter Biden has, or the problems that President Biden himself had with classified documents that he removed when he was vice president and stored at an office run by the University of Pennsylvania, where he just simply forgot about them. But the Biden administration has not been supportive of independent prosecutors and appointing independent prosecutors promptly in these cases. And I think that's part of the reason we are where we are today. An independent prosecutor should have been appointed to deal with January 6th and with Hunter Biden on January 20 of 2021. And these cases were allowed to drag on and on, in part because of the Biden administration's refusal to support the notion of independent counsels.
Okay, just lastly, I mean, we've had people on this program saying that this decision has permanently tarnished the legacy of the Biden administration. Don't know if you agree with that. And just one other thought, I just want to get your opinion on this. I read something that sort of seems to sum this up quite neatly. One of the commentators said that it's a surprise that's not at all surprising, this decision by President Biden to pardon his son. What do you make of that?
It's certainly not surprising that the President of the United States would want to pardon his own son who's been convicted of felonies. And I don't blame him for that. But this administration has been tarred by ethics scandals. The president's abuse of classified information between his vice presidency and his presidency was a serious matter. The fact that he left documents in the custody of the University of Pennsylvania through late 2022 and apparently simply forgot about them was a serious matter. His relationship with the University of Pennsylvania and the Penn Biden Center, I criticized strongly, and the quid pro quo for ambassadorships. We had scandals in the Biden administration, and the most tragic scandal was the cover-up of the president's capacity to serve a second term. People close to him in the White House knew that he was a one-term president. He had said he was going to run for one term and then pass the torch to the next generation. The Democratic Party should have had a primary, and Kamala Harris might very well have won that primary, but they ended up switching candidates in July with only 100 days to go. And Vice President Harris, in that scenario, really didn't stand a chance. So I don't think that the president was fair to his own country and to his party by not sticking by his most important pledge, which was that he was going to serve one term and pass the torch to the next generation. And that didn't happen.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed. We're going to have to leave it there. Richard Painter, thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you so much.
That's all we've got time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.